They're no good, spit them out, throw them out, but there's fresh coffee. I was just explaining
That's good.
that yeah. Yeah, you guys in the corner, leave your quarters on top, okay?
Chocolate?
Chocolate, yeah, well, that's not me, but I ate like 7 of them, so. I'm not gonna talk at all after this, I'm just the sales guy. No one wants to really hear from him, we wanna hear from Bill. But the only thing that I do wanna say is we are doing a follow-up event of this. It's at Spotlight Theaters in Hartford, which is right on Front Street. We did it about 2 months ago, and it's really cool. We partner with Palo Alto and Foresite, and it's really a vision into the dark web, into how easy it is to create malware now, and how easy it is. It kind of takes a little bit of what Bill's going to talk about today. You know, would you say maybe adds some steroids to it?
So Eric from who will likely be doing the Dark Side event is basically going to go much deeper than I go here, and he's going to talk about and demonstrate tools and techniques from the dark side of the web. So he really gets into the weeds and shows not just the technology, but the economic marketplace of these tools and techniques and how they all work together.
Yeah, you guys all know Mike Pennington from CEN? You ever worked with him?
Yeah.
He came, his mind was blown. I mean, he really thought it was cool. I consider Mike a very smart guy, so I'm using him as a reference point for how cool this event really is.
I thought it was cool.
Yeah, exactly. Again, a smart person. So it's cool. We're gonna do a couple demos. We left people last time. It's all educational. We left them kind of scared and really didn't know what tools might be out there to help them. So we're gonna have some demonstration stuff from Foresite, some stuff from Palo, more on what we call their traps product, it's an endpoint product. Not really too heavy into that. And then we're gonna watch Star Wars after, the day before it comes out. So it's gonna make for a long day. But bring your lightsaber, we're gonna have fun, best costume, we're giving away, you know, an Apple iWatch. I'm telling you, it's gonna be a really cool day, so if you can find the time, I urge you to come along. I'll make sure that Bryn, you have Bill's contact information. How many, by raising hands, I mean, how many people here are in security today, or is it just on the network side, or?
Any job necessary.
Yeah, anything necessary to get it done. Just trying to figure out a little bit more about it. Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay, awesome.
And this is that's my expectation, so that's good.
Yeah. All right, awesome. So without further ado, hand you over to Bill.
Awesome. So I'm Bill, or William Reynor, and I work for a company called Foresite, which works with Sean's company, IGX, which was recently purchased by E+, which is a different story. But we work together, and so Sean asked me to come and talk about security from an attacker's perspective. So my day-to-day job is I act as something called a penetration tester. And what a penetration tester does is they go out and they test networks as part of contract services, and we find vulnerabilities in systems, and then we document those vulnerabilities and come up with remediation plans to fix those vulnerabilities. So I'll start with my slides, who am I? So basically, I'm just another computer geek who likes playing with computer things and networks. I gravitated more towards penetration testing and security because it's something that I was always good at, and when I was younger, I was always poking at and learning more about. Some might say I have a mischievous mind for it. And then I have my disclaimer, which is any opinions I express are my own and don't necessarily represent my employer, even though the logo's there. I have been known to be wrong. So if I say something and you think it's incorrect, please bring it up to me, and I am very happy to discuss it. And the last thing I would say is that this presentation was put together this weekend, so please set your expectations accordingly. And you can, of course, follow me on Twitter. I post all about security things and other things, again, not necessarily company approved, but they're there. So my background, much like a lot of folks, Started with help desk and network admin, system admin, and then I got into a bit of consulting work, small business consulting, and then larger enterprise work, working for organizations like Delta Dental, ESPN, Xerox PARC. And then eventually I got involved in security assessment, compliance audit, and penetration testing, which is the work I now do and love. But I would say the vast majority of the experience that shaped my knowledge were things that I learned long ago, being that mischievous kid in high school and just playing on IRC and playing in, just playing with technology in general. So, screenshot of just a FNet IRC back office clients, which was a remote access Trojan, and that, of course, is the console to the thing that controls those things which are living on other computers. So that was my experience. That's the things I grew up playing with. And what I can say is not, from that perspective, not a lot has changed. The one thing that has changed is that the people who use these things now have very different motivations. So it's not just necessarily kids playing around and tinkering with technology anymore, but now you have products that are boxed up and operationalized and handed off in such a way that you don't need any knowledge of networking or computers. You can just go on tour and buy some software and buy the requisite pieces that you need, and all of a sudden, you can deploy undetectable malware. And so we'll get into that a bit more. So I've made some assumptions about the people attending, that you probably mostly have Windows networks that are domain joined. You have Macs, you have a limited number of Linux systems, you have some printers. And if you work in education, due to policy restrictions, you probably don't segment that well just because that's the name of the game, and that's those are the politics you're left to inherit. I'll put it that way.
Nicely put.
Yes. So, who in the audience thinks you're secure? Any hands? Sure. So the whole point of the talk is to point out some assumptions that I think folks make. And then basically each portion's going to build on itself. So I'm going to talk about operational security that's going to build into password hashing, which is going to build into a very old attack called pass the hash. And then we're going to talk about how none of that matters with malware, and that one piece of malware can basically go through and worm through your whole network if it's not thought out ahead of time. And so, wonderful animated slides. And if I'm moving too quick, feel free to stop me, or if you have any questions, just raise your hand.
Everybody here, Bill, okay?
Yep.
Okay.
It's the thing about I'll ask to play out. So we're going to talk about operational security and what an attacker would do if they were going to look at your network. So typically an attacker would go through a few stages. If I was Sean, I would call it the kill chain, which is a nice way to wrap around a certain set of steps that an attacker would take to try and break in or compromise a network. But it all starts with recon. So, and without getting too forward, for the operational section of this talk, I'll use a tool called Shodan on actual CEN assets, and just give you an idea of what sort of recon an attacker could do without ever touching or connecting to any of your educational assets, just to give you an idea of what's out there already. would say is, before anything, if you're not doing the bare basics, you probably want to make sure you're doing things like backups and updates. Updates are important, of course, because most exploits that are used in the wild are based off of software that's vulnerable and already patched. It just hasn't been patched yet, or the patch hasn't been deployed. And backups, of course, because when things are impacted, you want to be able to restore them. So as an attacker, we look for how your infrastructure is managed, if you're patching, antivirus, if web applications you have rolled out are using proper controls. And typically when we talk about web application controls, we talk about OWASP, which is the open web application. I can always goof on the acronym, but it's the Open Web Application Security Project. This thing. And it's just a fantastic resource for web applications to go through and understand and identify and what to look for when you're trying to identify if an application is vulnerable. And so one of the most common ways that I've seen web applications broken, and I don't even know if you'd call it broken, are just using default credentials. So someone just setting up an application, standing it up, and forgetting that there's some service account or something that just needs to be changed. And this isn't, and I'm sure like telling you this now, this seems like it's very reasonable that, you know, of course we would change the passwords. Who would not change the password of a web application and then point it to the internet? But the truth is something like 30 to 40% of the engagements I go on, I come across applications that have default credentials still. So one of the very first engagements I went on, I was tasked with running a penetration test, which is basically trying to find vulnerabilities and exploit them and then document the results for a radiology office. And so the client gave us the IP addresses, and you're wondering, why is there a picture of a car wash there? That doesn't make any sense. I'll get to that. So I start doing the normal pen testing things. I do port scanning and vulnerability scanning, and I find some services that are open. I find a web application. It's got some strange name. So I start searching Google for what that web application is. I look for documented vulnerabilities. I don't find anything. But I'm reading the manual, and it has a factory default password. And I'm like, oh, what the heck? We'll try it. So it allows me to log in, surprisingly. And I think it's a honeypot at first. It doesn't make any sense. Why would a radiology office have this strange website which has some sort of SCADA control operation mechanism and appears to be dealing with payment card processing? And then I realized that this is not a radiology office. This is a car wash. I'm like, why is there a car wash software running on this IP range that this radiology office asked me to test? And so I conferred back with the radiology office, and they said, no, here's the email from our ISP, here's the documentation, we own these IP addresses. And then I went to Aaron, and I saw that, no, you don't. They're owned by this car wash that I just accidentally broke into and have to explain and apologize to. So this is one of the first pen tests I'd ever been on, and default credentials. And this certainly wasn't the last, but this is one that I can't talk about. So low-hanging fruit is very common, and if you're not looking for these things, then they're probably not addressed. So I have three more other examples of just what I would call operational security failures. So one is a webcam. So I had a friend who had basically a security camera set up, hung off of his business internet connection, And the camera was set up in such a way that you could view it from anywhere on the internet. So it was just basically hanging off the internet. And he challenged me to try and break into this camera. I'm like, okay, well, let me see what I can find. So of course I tried the vault credentials for the manufacturer, and that doesn't work because he's a smart guy. And I look for vulnerabilities. I scan it with a vulnerability scanner called Nessus, and that doesn't find anything. But I document the version of the web application server called, it was a go-ahead web server. And based on that version information, bringing that back into Google, I find an exploit that's already been discovered by someone. And lo and behold, when I modify that exploit just a little bit, I'm able to just bypass the authentication to that webcam and take it over. So I guess the takeaway for webcam software like that is that, so if you have an Internet of Things device, an embedded device, and you just hang it off the internet, the way these devices are manufactured, it's usually a 1 or 2 year process, and by the time they're actually released and shipped, there's already been a number of discoveries and vulnerabilities made in the software. So I would just assume they're very insecure. So depending on how advanced that the embedded operating system is on things like these webcams, if they're taken over, they can be used as pivot points to get into the rest of your network. So if you see, for example, if this webcam had a back-end engine for Unix, I would easily be able to pivot off it and do things that are probably not good. So another example, I was working at a community college, and the typical way that images were deployed, we would take a disk, and we'd put the disk in the machine, and we'd start the computer. We'd boot it from the disk using a piece of software called Power Center Deploy Center, or I think it was PQDI were the initials of the software. The machine would boot up, it would authenticate against a file share. And then the file share, the machine would pull down an image and then deploy that image, or do the opposite. It would take an image of the machine and push it back up to the file server. And that's sort of the way images were deployed at the time. It wasn't centralized, or it wasn't as automated as things are now. But what struck me was that the credentials used to authenticate each machine to this central storage repository were all they were all domain admin credentials. And I knew this ahead of time, and so working in this lab, I scratched my head, and I was assured that these things are encrypted. There's no way that someone can grab one of these disks and recover the password of this. So after poking at one of these disks for about an hour, I figured out that yes, it's definitely encrypted. The password is securely stored in an encrypted fashion in a file called stuffit.dat. And the way the password is decrypted, a batch file calls an application called stuffit.exe. It looks for the stuffit.dat, and whatever it reads inside that file, it decrypts and then passes as a perimeter to the rest of the script, which means that there's no password at all. So all I had to do to get domain admin was just type stuffit.exe, and now I've got domain admin credentials. But we just assumed that the software provider and the vendor promised that it was encrypted, so it was encrypted. But sure, it was encrypted, but it wasn't really secure. And so the last little example that I'm just going to talk through has to do with something recent where I was working at a K-12, and as a consultant, so I already had administrative credentials, and I had some extra time, and I wondered to myself, if I was an attacker, what would it take to go from having limited guest access at a kiosk computer to having domain admin at this K-12. So the kiosk was locked down, they had a group policy, configured so that I couldn't just execute any program. but I was able to get Notepad to run. So once Notepad was open, I could browse the network from just a file open dialog box. Browsing the network, I found a server that had some shares that were open. One of the shares was called Backup, and lo and behold, inside that backup share was a Barracuda spam appliance configuration. So inside this Barracuda spam appliance configuration, which is all XML and clear text readable, are domain admin credentials, because we know those work and we need to get this rolled out quickly. So I guess I would say the takeaway from that last example is that there are two things that would have prevented me from doing that. So one would have been not using a domain admin account as a service account when it didn't need to be. And the last example, or the last thing, would be to change those ACLs on that file share in such a way that it's only accessible to that one account, because it only needed to be. It didn't need to be accessible to everyone. But if you're not thinking about this and you're in a rush, then it's very easy to just make things very insecure as a means of convenience. Did you have a question?
Me?
No.
No.
Oh, sorry. The other side. So, I decided to use Shodan as part of this presentation. And what Shodan is it's a search engine of sorts, but instead of using instead of indexing HTTP data, it indexes any service that's open and available. So any port, whether it's Telnet or if it's a high port, it scans everything and it indexes this. And this is all available to anyone who uses the service. And if you're in education, you can sign up for an account for Shodan for free, and they have API calls. And I would strongly encourage you to enter your IP ranges that you're responsible for and see what you see on there. You can request things to be removed, or better yet, you can ask for changes to be made in your firewall so that you don't need to request those changes. So here are some of the things that you can search for in Shodan. You can search for IP ranges, OSs, ports, and you can show before and after. So if a Shodan scan runs against an IP range you own, and then it runs again, I can actually show the difference. And so I started off, and I didn't know any of the CEN IP ranges, so I did what any person would do, and I went to Aaron, and I did a search for Connecticut Education Network, and I came up with a bunch of autonomous system numbers. And based on those autonomous system numbers, I picked one, entered the IP range for it, and drilled into what I thought were interesting services. So one of the interesting services I saw in this specific example was this thing called Tritium Niagara HTTPD server. And I didn't know what this was, so I decided that I would spend a little time researching it. So a few Google searches later, I've got the manual for what this thing is and how it works. And I drill in a little bit more. And this is the output from Shodan. So I've got some port numbers. I know this is an HVAC machine. And I have an idea now, based on the documentation that the manufacturer provided, of what its purpose is. So just looking at the information that was in Shodan, I now have internal IP addresses. I know this thing runs a Java virtual machine that's 1.5, which is pretty ancient, and there's tons of public exploits for it. But better yet, reading the actual documentation, I know that this is a reverse proxy, and that other parts of this system insecurely tunnel their data back into this system. So if you have ports open, and my thought with this was that probably an IT department didn't knowingly roll this service out. Typically what I've seen is some vendor comes in, they say they need X ports open. The IT department doesn't know anything about the service being rolled out. They just know that they have a request to open these ports, and so they do. And then they suddenly have a hole in their network. So I have a few few other examples of interesting things, and there's a ton of things that are out there to find, but these ones jumped out at me. So here's a core switch, a VIA for a smaller school. And the interesting thing about this is without ever connecting to it, without touching it, I have firmware and software versions for an VIA switch, which basically operates the same way as an HP switch. You're familiar with those, which happen to be vulnerable to a number of exploits. Using a number of search terms together, I decided that I would try and find a machine that was probably unmanaged and that the university that was hosting it probably wasn't updating. So using Shodan, I searched for some university where the operating system included both Windows and Apple components. So in this example, I looked for systems that had ARD open, but also had Windows components. And based on that, and I'll go back. So the interesting thing about this is that many universities do vulnerability scanning, so I was kind of confused why that was allowed to be open. But so for this specific thing that I found in Shodan, every single service was vulnerable to being exploited. And by exploited, I mean not just that you couldn't crash the service or do something bad to it, but you could take it over. So that specific version of SSH, this version of CUPS, that version of ARD, all had vulnerabilities like the system had never been updated before. And so those are the links to the actual published exploits. And CVSS scores for the exploits. So anything over 5 is typically pretty bad. And 7 to 8 means remote code execution typically. So jumping in from external networks into internal networks, I wanted to so jumping into internal networks, I wanted to talk about some very old but typically pervasive attacks that still work on most networks. And these attacks typically work against networks that are very flat or don't have ACLs. So the first type of attack is called ARP cache poisoning or ARP spoofing. So this is a little technical. So basically the way ARP caching or ARP spoofing works is as an attacker, I use ARP packets, and ARP packets are required on an IPv4 network. And what they do is they convert MAC addresses to IP addresses. So when computers are communicating inside a local network, they use layer 2, which is all MAC protocol. So if I want to communicate to this gentleman in front of me, and he wants to communicate with me, we don't necessarily talk to each other via our IP address. What we do is I say, what's your MAC address? He says, what's my MAC address? And then we have that conversation based on those MAC addresses, not necessarily over IP. It's not until we cross a gateway or a router that we use IP. So within this protocol is inherently insecure because there's no authentication. So I can reply to anyone on this network via broadcast and say, I'm someone I'm not, and they will cache that information, and then when they go to reply to the person they think they were talking to, they'll actually reply to me. And so that's the basis behind our cache poisoning. And so this is a better way to demonstrate that. So you can see we've got Alice, Bob, and Charlie. Alice is A, Bob is B, Charlie is C. Charlie tells Alice that Bob is actually C, and Charlie tells Bob that Alice is actually C. And then when Bob and Alice try and communicate, they're actually talking to Charlie instead of each other. So the tools to execute, go ahead.
You got a hub listed in there in the center instead of a switch. Is this our cache poisoning dependent on using old style hubs instead of switches?
So it'll work with a hub, but it works against a switch if everything's the same broadcast domain and you don't have other things that mitigate it. So if you're in a hub, everything's broadcast to everything, and you can, so you get, yeah. But ARP cache poisoning, basically,
It can work with a switch then?
yes. So there's a very old tool that's used for demonstrating this attack. It's called Enable. It's been around probably 15 years or more. It's very easy to use. I would not be surprised if people in the schools that you manage use this tool. So this is how it works. I scan an IP range. I have a list of devices that I've found, and this is doing all our broadcast. So if you were listening on the network and you saw a bunch of broadcasts from a device that wasn't a router or a network device, then you would, you might actually spot someone trying to do this. And then from the attacker's perspective, they choose two devices that they want to get in between. So in this case, I pick my default gateway, and I pick one of the client machines. And then I can capture anything that goes in between those 2 points. So you may think, well, but we use encryption, and there's SSL, and there's alerts, and that's true. With a tool like Enable, it will generate on the fly SSL certificates if a user tries to access a secure site. But they will get an error message because the certs won't match. But the trouble is many users just will click OK anyway. I think it's more troubling that it's much easier, it's fairly easy to capture password hashes, which I think is really what this tool is intended to be used for. But while that Enable session's going and I've poisoned that traffic, not just passwords, but all the traffic going back and forth between attacker and victim is being captured. And so you may think, well, that's not a big deal. People who might tinker or play with a tool like this, they're students, they're not network engineers, they can't use Wireshark. That would be kind of ridiculous to expect them to understand output from a tool like this. But the truth is if they just save that information to a different type of file format, then they can use a tool like Network Miner. And Network Miner basically will take any PCAP and just pull raw data out of it. So you can pull whatever's gone over the wire and whatever's clear text. So in this example, these are just HTTP requests. And you can see these are the files that it scraped from those captures. And you can see that I actually was able to save those files, so whatever those certificates were. But if I was having an IM conversation and that wasn't encrypted, or any sort of session information that wasn't already encrypted, this could be captured. And certainly any sort of initial authentication. So if you're authenticating to a domain server and those credentials are captured, or those hashes are captured, then those could potentially be compromised. So the point I want to make with a tool like this is that this isn't difficult. This is something that a student could definitely do. And I say this from personal experience. And it's something to be concerned about that should not be an issue, but I see repeatedly in client networks that I assess. So some things you can do to stop the attack, or stop ARP cache poisoning. EPO and SEP now include features which detect when MAC addresses change on the network. But a better fix is enabling something called dynamic ARP inspection. And this is a painful process to, I've got you.
So just real quick, I think we're going to share also, we're going to share these slides with everyone. So I know that we're going through some of the URLs a little quick. You are going to have all that information. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. and using this tool or using a similar tool yourself is helpful to know if you're vulnerable to an attack like this, because you don't know if you don't test it yourself or hire someone to test it for you. And so that's part of what Foresite does. And I would say the other thing, when we're talking about firewall and switch configurations and what the right thing to do is, because there's always debate and there's always politics when we're talking about how things should be configured. A good starting place, I would say, are benchmarks. And the two main places that I think you ought to look at benchmarks are either CIS Security or the NSA. And they both publish guides for what are best practices. And I've included those links at the end of this presentation, which will be emailed out to you. The NSA has documentation for secure switch configuration specifically to mitigate against this very attack. So the other type of attack that's layer 2 that's very common that many people don't think about, and our cache poisoning is fairly, I feel like people are just starting to become aware that it's a major issue, even though it's been around for a very, very long time. So a company called TrustWave created a script called Responder as part of their assessment arm. And so the way this script works is it responds to any NetBIOS request or any LLMR request. And it registers itself as WPAD and basically encourages clients to authenticate against it. And once authentication happens, it just captures those hashes or passwords or whatever it can. If it can capture clear text, it will. If it can capture hashes, it will. So instead of doing out cache poisoning, it basically, say you try and resolve a domain that doesn't exist. So billmachine.lan. So you type //billmachine.lan, try and get to that machine. It doesn't exist in DNS, so the machine broadcasts for it. What this script does is it will respond to your broadcast and say, here it is, it's right here, this thing that you were looking for. And then you'll try connecting to it, because that's the way that Windows will try and perform resolution. So this graphic on the side shows you all the steps that Windows will try and use for resolution. So it's right in these, the NetBIOS and the LLMNR broadcast that this issue exists. So just in the lab, here's what this looks like. So you can see at the top there, I ran the script, I gave it my IP address, and about a minute later, I have hashes. This attack, everywhere I've used this script before we've gone into remediation, this has worked. It's kind of scary. So the way to mitigate this is to disable link local multicasting resolution, which I'm trying to remember that, but it'll be in the notes. And to disable NetBIOS over TCP, which is that little checkbox when you're configuring TCP IP settings. If you have group policy objects, or if you have Active Directory deployed, which hopefully you do, you can craft a GPO to not use the autoconfig WPAD address, or you can focus on hardening and making sure that a WPAD configuration does exist if you use it. And that'll prevent, so the way those machines, the way a machine will try and reach out is it'll actually search for wpad.yourdomain.com or whatever the internal domain is, and if it resolves, it'll try and pull a configuration file to figure out how it should configure itself for proxy settings. So if you're not using a proxy or you have a transparent proxy, just disable it. And then similarly for switch configurations, baseline configurations exist for servers and for desktops. And so those are super helpful for config. All right. So this is just section 1, but I wanted to take questions here before we move too far forward. If anyone has any questions. Yes, sir.
You were collecting those password hashes, and then you mentioned using Miner to try to extract. That's successful. I mean, I've never actually seen it work at all myself.
So Miner is just used to extract files. The hashes are different. So
Okay.
So I would use a separate tool. I would use a tool like Jack the Ripper, or even within Can Enable, there's a way to crack password hashes. So Network Miner is just to carve out raw data from those captures, because Can Enable didn't do that natively. So I use the other tool, Network Miner, to, like, for instance, if someone was like browsing the web and they were antivirus is dead, some people will say it still has a place in an organization. But I would say anytime before the first 24 to 48 hours of a new release of malware, most antivirus is useless, and I would, and I'll show that in the next few slides. So hopefully everyone here knows what malware is. It's just malicious software. Latest versions of malware have been commercialized and operationalized in such a way that they're packaged up and sold to people who want to steal information. So in the next few slides, I'll show some demo work that I did over this weekend. And first and foremost, executing malware on a computer you don't own is illegal. Even if you do own the computer, it can still put you in legal peril. I would just not run anything malicious at home, work, or anywhere else, because it can do things that you don't expect. So we talked about passwords and hashing. So what if we didn't need hashes to log in at all? What if we could just know what the password was? So for this example, I went and, so malware is analyzed and traded, and researchers will post samples. So I went out to a researcher website in a forum, and I grabbed a sample of a piece of banking malware that was discovered in August of this year. So I download it and I run it inside of my sandbox. And of course you can see it beacon out to all these RU domains, even though this is a default machine that has no other software running. I ran this malware and I can see obviously it's infected. It's now trying to reach out to its command and control structure. And if I scan it with an up-to-date antivirus, of course it's detected as a Trojan, which it is. So this is latest Kaspersky AV, latest app file. But what if someone modifies it? What if they encrypt it? And so that's part of what I wanted to talk about. So if someone wants to take a piece of malware and make it so it's not detectable anymore, they don't have to write a new piece of malware. All they have to do is run it through a process to change the way the code is laid out internally. And these services are called cryptors. And these services are called FUDs, or fully undetected. So basically, the way crypto works is I take a current piece of malware, I combine it with a stub, which is a C program, and I save that file as my new variant. And it's fairly simple to do. So there's a piece of research software called PE Scrambler, and it's been around for between 6 to 10 years. It's hard for me to figure out exactly when it was released. So I don't know if anyone follows Brian Krebs. Krebs is an investigative journalist. He covers malware markets, mostly Russian. But the thing that he noticed is that crypting services are the reason that most AV is broken now. So, how does PD Scrambler work? So, it basically rearranges, it takes portions of code and puts it in different places, and then resaves that information. Part of it is rerouted through different function calls. So to use it, I basically call the program PD Scrambler. I give it an input file, I give it an output file, and now I have a new sample. And I run that sample against Kaspersky again, which is up to date, latest stats, same one that discovered the malware initially, and Kaspersky sees nothing. And I run the same piece of encrypted malware in my sandbox again, and obviously it's still working. So the next thing I did, just to make sure it was completely functional and still working, is I ran it through a website called VirusTotal. And so VirusTotal has about 55 different antivirus engines. And so this is the original sample, and you can see it's detected by about 42?
42 out of 55.
42 out of 55, and that's 3 months old. And then you can see this is my sample that I just encrypted, and 17 of the 55. So this wasn't, this is using a type of cryptor that's very old and has been in public domain for a long time now, but is still very effective at hiding malicious software, and for this case, just research software. So this is just for research to demonstrate the concept. So again, I ran the same sample through a sandbox, so it's called the Cuckoo Sandbox, and they have there's a website that you can just submit samples to called malware.com. It's malwr.com, not the full malware spelled out. And so you can see, here's the original sample, and you can see all the things it does. And this website's great, by the way, because it'll show you screen captures of what the system's actually doing, what files and registry changes it touches, what changes it makes. And then this is the after crypting, and it's doing all the same things, except my Kaspersky doesn't see it anymore. Now, a lot of folks may think that simply by blacklisting the hash of the executable, that's enough. And I just wanted to point out that the hash, of course, has changed after I encrypt, and the hash is always going to be different after every new release of malware. So using the hash of a file in some sort of security product to block a specific piece of malware from spreading is probably not going to be effective. And there's different types of malware that will change on purpose just to get around this type of attack. So the takeaways from this, PD Scrambler has been around for 10 years. Kaspersky scanned clean, AV didn't pick up. The only thing that really noticed that something was up was that VirusTotal, some of the engines noted that that sample was quote-unquote packed or encrypted. But that didn't really give me a good idea of what was going on inside the program until I actually ran it in a sandbox. So this is a 10-year-old encrypting service that was released for public demonstration. So if this is 10 years old, imagine what a commercial solution looks like. And so you may be wondering, well, how difficult is it to find a commercial encrypting solution to encrypt a piece of malware that I've created, or a piece of malware that I've purchased? Because you can do either. And third link from the top, I've got Cryptor, the best cryptor, undetectable, fully undetectable. And of course I can have their public version, which is seen before. I can have a private version, which is limited release for $30, or I can have a unique stub, which is something that's only released to me, just for me, which basically guarantees that anything I create with this is not going to be detectable by anything. And it won't be detectable as a cryptor either, because these AV engines haven't seen the original stub that is actually doing the encrypting.
That will be traceable to you.
Maybe. So typically the way those are purchased, it's all done through Tor, and it's all done with Bitcoin. And I know Bitcoin isn't perfect, but it would be difficult to trace it back, especially if it's foreign. So a lot of folks get malware all the time. We clean it, we re-image sometimes when it's convenient, and it's all better. So the point of this portion of the presentation that I wanted to make is that it's not, that's not right anymore. So this isn't just used for sending spam and malware. Malware nowadays is being used to scrape everything that's sellable on a machine. So that includes all the credentials, all email, any private information, basically anything. And using the other methods that we talked about before, using pass the hash techniques, these can be all combined to create a perfect storm, if you will, of malware infestation, where you can have everything stolen from you fairly quickly. These things spread fast, and once they grab information from a machine, it's a few megs of specific documents. So the demonstration that I wanted to use to demonstrate what a malicious program might be capable of is an application called Mimikatz. And so Mimikatz is used, it's an open source application that was created basically as a C project to demonstrate some vulnerabilities in security and scraping clear text passwords and hashes on memory. So Mimikatz integrates directly with another application used in security assessments called Metasploit, and both of these things are open source. So how does this work? What's the difficulty in using an application like Mimikatz? So I don't know if folks here use Linux at all, but generating a payload is not too difficult. It's definitely Googleable. So here's an example I used in my lab. I created a payload interpreter. If I wanted to, I could have run that through a crypting service. So I set up my interpreter host to listen for connections from the payload that I just generated. So I hand ran this specific piece of malware, but that's not how most malware is going to run on your machine. Most malware is going to run through a drive-by attack or some exploit or through some social engineering type of attack. And now I've got a connect back from that interpreter session. I set up the interpreter session to load the Mimikatz module. And so this is sort of a long roundabout way, but I wanted to give you an idea of these are open source tools, and these are fairly simple to put together. And they seem like they're complicated, but they're not really. So now that I've got Mimikatz running on that machine, I've got that module loaded. The first thing I do is dump the SAM, and I have an NTLM hash. Now I can traverse the network with whatever that hash is. Or I can just dump out the clear text passwords, because I can scrape memory directly. So anyone that's logged in, I can just scrape the clear text password. And then finally, there were some interesting things that Mimikatz does by patching different portions of memory, specifically on domain controllers. So one of the interesting features of Mimikatz was that it has this skeleton key module, which allows you to patch memory in such a way that once this is executed and once memory is modified, that any domain account will accept the password Mimikatz, which is fairly insane. And so running this on my lab domain controller, no issues at all. It patched it, and I was able to log in. Another interesting feature was that I could sync any Active Directory object and basically pretend to be another domain controller. So that meant that I could sync out, say, the administrator and all the different hashes of the administrator. So everything from NTLM to LM. And then I could, of course, take those hashes and put them back into an application like Kane. And because it spit out the LM hash for backward compatibility, that looks like it'll take about 2 2 hours. And so that's what I have for the malware section. I just wanted to point out that AV is not the end-all be-all. Even if it's set up and perfectly up to date, when it's within the first 12 to 24 hours, it is not going to detect things that are new. And if you go to the dark side event that we'll have in Hartford on the 17th, I think his name is Eric from Palo Alto, actually has research directly on darknets, where he actually went and bought malware, bought actual stubs. So everything I used was open source, but everything Eric is going to use in the dark side of the web event are all commercial, or I'm sorry, they're all crimeware tools. So these are things that he actually bought with Bitcoin through Tor, and he documents how he did that and what that looks like. And it's extremely effective. Any questions as far as malware goes?
What about complaints such as Forgate that uses heuristics to identify actual incidents that actually look like other incidents, or learns to identify this? How effective is that against this kind of malware?
Not at all. They test against it before they release it. So what they'll do is they actually have paid services, and they'll run their samples against those services to make sure it's undetectable before it's released. And so this, you saw they called it FUD, or fully undetectable. That means that they're going to check all the name brand antivirus applications to make sure it's undetectable. And you pay for the privilege, about $100. And depending on what you buy, as someone who wants to spread malware, say you have a distribution point. Part of the services that these organizations will offer, I don't want to call them companies because they're not really companies, they will, once a sample becomes detectable, and they know it becomes detectable, they will refresh and basically regenerate the piece of malware at the distribution point, and so they're constantly sending out things that are undetectable.
So not even a hardened compliance.
No. No. And so Palo Alto has some tools that look for, instead of looking for signatures, it looks for how exploits occur. So it looks for things like, what do they call it, knot sledding or heap spraying. And they work right now, is what I would say, but they're not foolproof. So best practice: segment, monitor, whitelist applications. If you have a web filter, I would block anything that's unknown or unlisted, and that's of course politically difficult sometimes. But there are some community colleges and some organizations that have suffered pretty horrific breaches that I think would speak to the fact that implementing these measures are far less painful than dealing with what a large-scale breach would look like.
I think the application whitelisting VDI seems to be kind of the way to go.
Yeah, definitely. It's not 100%, but it's way better than not doing anything, and it's better than just AV alone. There are things that look for it and try and bypass it, and there's always, it's a cat and mouse game, right? But between whitelisting and doing filtering for the unknown and paying attention to egress, you can fairly quickly pick up what's going on. But again, you have to have resources to be able to do that. So if you're tasked to work on 25 different projects and do monitoring, guess what's not getting monitored? And that's just the way it goes until things become more important. Any other questions?
I think a lot of us are reactive, though. I mean, I don't know how many of you have the ability to dedicate 8 hours a day to security.
No.
And incoming, monitoring incoming threats.
Yep. Yeah,
We're not banks or the U.S. government. We don't have that kind of budget, so we become reactive.
And you don't have the compliance requirements that PCI.
So we're not being forced to where we wouldn't be budgeted. Exactly.
Right.
And they're not doing so good lately either.
No.
No, it's true.
The resources they have.
I mean, Scott, I mean, how much do you dedicate to it?
We have 0 people dedicated.
Yeah, so, and they've got a pretty good budget.
In all seriousness, I mean, when we are aware of a security issue at one of our schools, we do the best to let people know.
Sure.
And try to help give you some resources to point you in the right direction. When we are made aware of an issue with our infrastructure, we monitor, I would say, okay, but not great. There's certainly room for improvement. But we monitor lists and watch for the problems with different equipment that we operate, and try to stay current on that.
Right.
But-
Like DNS attacks, I mean, they have so much bandwidth. If a small network like ours gets a DNS attack, it takes a while for them to see it because it's just the amount of bandwidth they monitor.
No, that's true, and I'm sure Mike could speak more to DDoS mitigation, but it's definitely an issue, and it's definitely something that I'm sure CEN sees more often than not, denial of service in general. And
Yeah,
it's probably
every
something,
day.
yeah.
Every day somebody's being attacked at this point. And so the ones, the attacks that we used to notice were very easy to pick out, right? There's a 20 gig DOS directed at a school that's connected at 1 gig. And yeah, that's gonna fill your pipe and you're gonna think the whole internet's down, right? So those are easy to detect. The harder ones to detect are, I'm not sending a lot of volume, but the volume's small, but the amount, the quantity of packets that I'm sending are really high. So we had a school last week that had a couple attacks against them, and it was port 80 UDP traffic to IP on their firewall that only does that. Port 80 doesn't go anywhere. And that firewall's sitting there inspecting packets left and right, and the CPU's at 100%, and guess what? I think something's wrong with our firewall, right? And we're looking at that and going, yeah, it's getting slammed with UDP packets on port 80 from all over Asia. You're getting attacked. But we didn't see the bandwidth actually go up. It's the number of packets went up. So they're starting to, it's a daily issue. I mean, and I think if we looked at our traffic, we would see that throughout the day, way more than, but we don't go looking for it very closely yet. And that's some area for improvement for our team here.
It has some pretty decent open source SIM appliances, like OSIM. I think if you configure all your endpoints to send logs to it, authentication logs, you'll notice pretty quickly if they are traversing through all your endpoints.
So what I've found working in SIMs is that it's very easy to drown with data. SIMs are, so you've operated syslog before? If they're not configured correctly, you can just, and you don't have event correlation rules configured, it is very easy to just not be able to spot anything useful. What Foresite does is they have their provision platform. So what they do is they put an appliance on-prem, point everything at that appliance, firewall, switch, infrastructure-wise, and then they have a specific set of rules that they look for very specific things. And we find that approach works in combination with threat intel. So, okay, we see connections from this IP address, we know this is bad. We know you don't do business with China, but we're seeing inbound connections from China. That sort of thing can be helpful, especially detecting attack. From a network monitoring standpoint, just looking at S-flow data and charting that data for anomalies is useful. And there's open source tools for that as well.
Yeah, and I like even in the VM environment, you put the sensors right on the virtual switch, and you get all kinds of baselines. I mean, but they are pretty complex to configure and maintain.
Yeah, and if you're not comfortable with open source OSSIM, there's a solution from a company called Alien Vault, and that just basically wraps a nice GUI around it and makes it much easier to deal with.
That's what we use.
Oh, okay, nice. Do you have anything that?
So if there's no further questions, I just wanted to take a minute to really thank William for coming out today, Foresite and IGX Global for helping sponsor this. I hope you found it valuable. We're happy to host these. We'd like to host some more of these types of events in the future. And so if you have feedback, good, bad, otherwise, topics that you want to see, we're happy to try to line some of that up and bring in the experts to talk to you. If I can take just a minute to kind of plug our conference, you know, a lot of this leads up to our conference, and we would have sessions like this at our conference as well. But the feedback is really critical to us to, you know, so if there's something you want to see at our conference, please let us know. And just take a note that this year our conference is May 13th, Friday the 13th. So come out and don't be scared. Come out and join us. It should be a great conference. And thanks again, William, for sharing all your some of your expertise with us.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're gonna distribute or find some of the.
Yep, so what I'm gonna do is I'll send that out now, and then, whatever the email address that you registered for,